Chapter 7 is about ethics, social responsibility, and the business manager. First thing that they want to discuss is ethics, which they define as the study of what makes up good and bad conduct, inclusive of related actions and values. They talk about business ethics, which is the study of what makes up good and bad conduct as related to business activities and values. Social responsibility, which is the concern of business entities about profit seeking and non-profit seeking activities and their unintended impact on others directly or indirectly involved. Theories of ethical thought. Consequential theories are acts that are judged good or bad based on whether the acts have achieved their desired results. Acts of the business community or any other social unit like government, school, fraternity, sorority, act and rule utilitarianisms are two sub-schools. Deontological theories, actions that can be judged good or bad based on rules and principles that are applied universally. Humanist theories, actions are evaluated as good or bad depending on whether they contribute to improving inherent human capacities such as intelligence, wisdom, and self-restraint. When it comes to the business ethics, they create a code of ethics, which is a formal statement that acts as a guide for making decisions and actions within an organization. Establish a workplace or an office for the sole purpose of overseeing the organizational practices to determine if actions are ethical. They have conduct training programs to encourage ethical practices within the organization. They're able to minimize their situations in which unethical behavior is common and create conditions in which people are likely to behave ethically. Practices that result in unethical behavior are to 1. Give unusually high rewards for good performance, and 2. Uncommonly harsh punishments for poor performance. So what they were saying was that it's the manager's hope to represent the organization in a respectable manner by removing those two practices. When it comes to the corporate ethics, they adopted the code of conduct, apply it to the upper and middle level management, implemented by a CEO or a designated agent. They establish sanctions for deviant behavior ranging from personal reprimands that are placed in the employee's file all the way to dismissal. Some codes do allow for due process hearings where the employee is given a chance to defend themselves. I know in the state of Ohio we are an at-will state, which means as an employee going to work for said employer, you do sign paperwork that says, I do agree that at any time I can be released of my duties without just cause. So that being said, whether you have broke the code of conduct, code of ethics, it doesn't matter. They can just say, we don't want you working here anymore, and it's time for you to go. And there's nothing that you can do or say about it. I mean, you can try to do something or say something about it, but you're still gone. And they're allowed to do that, and you knew that going into the position. As far as industry code of ethics, it says that it contains a list of shall nots, a model of do's and don'ts, which generally address itself to subjects such as honest and fair dealings with customers, acceptable levels of safety, efficacy, and cleanliness, non-deceptive advertising, maintenance of experienced and trained personnel, competent performance of services, and furnishings of quality products. The professional code of ethics, they shared that managers often interact with individual employees who are subject to professional codes of conduct that may supersede corporate or industry-wide codes. Professionals are designed as to having the following traits: educational training. They have some form of licensing, which they've possibly had to take some exams for that requirement. A set of written ethical standards enforced by a group. Formal association or group that meets regularly. Independent commitment to public interest. Formal recognition by the public as a professional group. They also touched upon accountants, CPAs, for example. They would be considered committing a felony under any state law. Failure to file an income tax return, filing a fraudulent return, aiding in the preparation of that fraudulent income tax return of a client. When it comes to insurance and finance, there is clearly a code of ethics, and it's left primarily to the local chapters, and their discipline includes reprimand, censure, and dismissal. The definition of law was mentioned as the talking about people who study law. The American Bar Association's model rules of professional responsibility were submitted to the highest courts. Violation may lead to warnings, reprimands, public censure, suspension, or disbarment, as we discussed in our homework assignment about the case and his disbarment and whether or not he agreed with that, and the fact that he went into it knowing that if he was ever convicted of a felony, it was automatic disbarment. So right there told you that he wasn't going to be able to fight the case or the outcome of it. Schools of social responsibility talked about profit-oriented school. Business entities are distinct organizations in our society whose sole purpose is to increase profit for shareholders. They have managerial school, which advocates of this theory argue that business entities, particularly large ones, have a number of groups that they must deal with, including stockholders, employees, customers, activist groups, and government regulators. Institutional school, which said business entities have a responsibility to act in a manner that benefits all of society. Professional obligation school, which is business managers and members of boards of directors must be certified as the professionals. Before they assume those responsibilities, they must have a responsibility to the public interest beyond making profits. Regulation school, all business units are accountable to elected officials. Managerial school, large institutions have a number of interest groups or constituents, both internally and externally, that they must deal with regularly, not just stockholders and a board of directors. Institutional school, business entities have a responsibility to act in a manner that benefits all of society, just as churches, unions, courts, universities, and governments have. When they do fail to deal adequately with externalities, they should be held accountable, not only to the boards of directors, but also to the government enforcement. Professional obligation school, advocates of the School of Social Responsibility state that business managers and members of boards of directors should be certified as professionals before they are allowed to assume managerial responsibility. Regulation school, which sees all the business units as accountable to elected public officials. Chapter 8 goes into talking about the intentional environment of business. We have political dimensions, economic dimensions, making sure that you look at the country analysis before deciding to do business with them. Focus on the differences in size and the economic growth rate. The impact of the central planning versus a market economy. The availability of disposable income. The existence of an appropriate transportation infrastructure. Cultural dimensions. Culture may be defined as learned norms of a society that are based on values, beliefs, and attitudes. They also talk about corruption in trade. It's become very competitive, and sometimes bribery gets involved in that. They talked about national legal systems. There's 5 major laws: common law, Romano, which is Germanic civil law, Islamic law, socialist law, and Hindu law. Of course, common law is the one that we are most familiar with. Companies doing business in the U.S., England, and it said 26 former British countries. The source of law is primarily case law and precedent instead of statutory law. They went on to talk about private and public international law, where the law governs the relationship between the nations, and the public international. When it comes to the private, the law that governs the relationship between private parties involved in their transactions across the borders. Licensing, franchising, having foreign subsidiary, joint ventures, expropriation, which is the taking of private property by a host or country government for political or economic reasons. They further discussed the Bilateral Investment Treaty, otherwise known as BIT. It's the treaty between 2 parties to outline conditions for investment in either country. There's the Act of State Doctrine, a state that each nation is bound to respect their independence of another, and the courts of one nation will not sit in judgment on the acts of the courts of another nation. They do have controls for export and import, along with NAFTA, which is North American Free Trade Agreement's purpose, which is to reduce trading costs, increase business investment, and help North America be more competitive in the global marketplace. And the agreement is between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. And then they talked about the overall globalization, which is the economic growth being the main channel through which the globalization can affect poverty. In general, what they're saying is when countries are open to trade, they tend to grow faster and the living standards tend to increase down to the poor. But it also has been said that the poor do not always share in the gains from the trade. So it can go either way. And as I had stated, the ethics I could definitely relate to. We have code of conduct. We have ethics. As a professional myself, I know that I signed a contract going into the work that I'm doing for a few different things. One of the things that we all had to sign recently, which was due to some complaints, all the employees had to agree not to talk about each other, discuss things behind their backs through text, written messages, or even have side conversations or meetings about said person. If we have an issue with another employee that we're working with, we are to bring it to the employer and then discuss it that way, as far as kind of like a mediation, but I don't really want to say it's officially like we're going to have mediation, but definitely discuss it instead of talking about the other person behind their back. And this was all come about because conflict in the workplace, and ultimately that all fell back to the management or lack thereof, and the employees taking upon themselves to do things that they knew were not the way that things were to be done. And that is my take on chapter 7 and 8.